Thank you. Servus. My name is Adriana.
I'm Josh.
And today we are going to talk to you about Uncovered, the hard truth about OTel's vendor neutrality. So it all began with a LinkedIn post that Josh did earlier this year, in which he says, I still hear people saying that OpenTelemetry is vendor neutral, so you can switch vendors anytime you want to. And then I thought, hey, that's actually a really good point. And I'm a serial blogger, so I actually wrote a blog post with my thoughts on that topic. And then Josh and I got to talking. We know each other from OpenTelemetry, CNCF Slack. And we thought, hey, could we dig a little bit deeper into this and craft a talk out of it? Obviously, the answer is yes, because here we are. So today we're going to take you on a little journey and explore what OpenTelemetry's vendor neutrality is all about. And it begins with standardization. And we like standardization because if you've been around long enough, remember cell phones, when you switch cell phones and you had to, every time you switch cell phones, even if it was the same vendor, you would get a different charging cable. So then you ended up with a mess of charging cables, which was really annoying.
Yeah, and if you're even older, you might remember pre-USB, right? We had serial ports on our computers, and that was kind of a pain. So I'm really grateful for standards like USB.
Oh my God, big time. And this is perfect because we would like you to join our lovely Slido and tell us what you're grateful for. And I'm going to put on the Jeopardy music while you log in and do the Slido. So can you hear it? Now, this is perfect timing because as was mentioned, I am from Canada, and we are celebrating Canadian Thanksgiving coming up this weekend. So our Thanksgiving takes place in October, and the American Thanksgiving takes place in November. Ours celebrates the harvest, so good timing.
Good look. Good answer. Great answers in here. Yes, USB-C, OTel, yeah.
Yay. Okay, we'll give it a couple more.
Coffee. I didn't know there's a standard for coffee.
Damn, that's like some hardcore coffee love here.
Yeah. I'm grateful for coffee in general, though.
No, fair. I never got into coffee. I'm more of a tea drinker.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating. Oh, yeah, JSON,
Yeah.
HTTP, HTML, yeah, beer bottles.
Yep.
Like that one.
Yep. But USB-C getting a lot of the love. YAML getting some love. Okay. That's just the right crowd for us.
I am Team YAML. I prefer YAML over JSON. Metric system. Yes, I love the metric system. In Canada, we do the metric system. So
we're so bad at this. We do everything.
Okay. So here's one thing that we're grateful for, and thank you for playing along. We are grateful for OpenTelemetry as a standard. And I guess before we continue, we should probably introduce ourselves. My name is Adriana Villela, and I am a CNCF ambassador, serial blogger, podcaster, and I'm also one of the maintainers of the OpenTelemetry end user SIG. By day, I am a principal developer advocate at Dynatrace, and I spend most of my time in the observability and OpenTelemetry space. By night, I like to climb rocks, so I've actually checked out a couple of local bouldering gyms here in Vienna. I love to visit gyms in the cities that I go to. And I also love capybaras because they make me happy.
Yeah, and I'm Josh. I am an open source advocate at Altinity. I'm pretty much obsessed with open source observability. And I like to say that I'm technical enough to get myself into trouble, which I often do with some of our open source projects around ClickHouse and Kubernetes. And I did try to keep up with Adriana on one of the climbing walls around here. It was awesome.
And to be fair, he just arrived yesterday, so I'm surprised he lasted as long as he did. So
yeah, it was a little rough. All right, so what are we going to actually talk about? I'll go through this real briefly so that we can then get into it. So I like to start with why, right? Why are we even here? Why does OpenTelemetry exist? How did we get here? Then we're going to talk about like what actually is neutral, because it is true that there's a lot of vendor neutrality benefits that we get from OpenTelemetry, and we'll talk about those and how you can take advantage of them. We're going to talk about my favorite part of that vendor neutrality, which is the interoperability and the ability to use multiple tools together. And we're going to get into what actually isn't neutral, where the actual challenges are today. And then finally, we're going to talk about the future and some of the things that some of our vision for the future And then also what is awesome today about OpenTelemetry. Adriana and I actually met because we both think that OpenTelemetry is awesome, and it is awesome.
Yes, it is.
So OpenTelemetry exists because of distributed tracing. This is, I think, helpful to understand some background, right? So first of all, observability begs to be open. When we're dealing with observability systems, anything less than 100% coverage is really, really unacceptable. We need that ability to cover every specific tool and technology that we're using. And if we think back to like proprietary tools, often even the really, really good ones would get us 85, 90% coverage. And then we had to rely on the vendor updating it to get us the other things that we needed. But with OpenTelemetry, anybody can contribute. It's open source, right? So I really think that observability tools, when they're open, give us a much better opportunity to get to that 100% coverage. We did have good solutions for this, right? Like Prometheus is a great open source standard for metrics. And within the Linux ecosystem, right, we have tons of great open source standards for logging. So we kind of had this problem solved once upon a time, but then along come microservices, right? And they changed the challenge. So with microservices and distributed systems, all of a sudden, it's not just one server responding to a request with a nice, stack trace that we can look at to see what's wrong. We need each system to understand a little bit of the systems around it. All of a sudden, the Java developers have to care about what the Python developers are doing and vice versa. And so the problem of distributed tracing is a little bit more complex than metrics or logging, where we can just emit a number or a log line and be done with it. We need context from the other services, which means everything needs to talk to everything else. The first solution that we got to this, right, was distributed tracing powered by vendor tools, which is a great way to solve the problem, but it lacked that openness, right? And so that is, I think, why OpenTelemetry exists, is because we needed an open standard specifically for distributed tracing. Now, of course, it does much more than distributed tracing, but I don't think we would have gotten there without that need.
Absolutely. And that brings us to what makes OpenTelemetry vendor neutral. And really what it boils down to is one simple thing. In the before times, if you wanted to switch instrumentation telemetry vendors, you were pretty much screwed because each vendor had their own set of instrumentation libraries. So you had to really hate your vendor to be able to switch vendors because it took a really long time.
Years.
Painful. But with OpenTelemetry, you're like, hey, you know what? I hate my vendor. I want to break up with them. I want to switch to this other vendor. Guess what? You don't have to re-instrument your code, which is awesome. You just point your destination to a different observability backend. But what exactly specifically makes OpenTelemetry vendor neutral? Well, it's thanks to these components. We have semantic conventions, the API and SDK, OTLP, and finally, the OTel collector. So what are these specifically? Well, let's start with semantic conventions. You can think of semantic conventions as a standard set of labels for your telemetry. So all of your traces that are emitting are going to have a set of standard labels. Sure, you might add your own labels, but it's going to have a core set of labels. And you can see that with, for example, our picture here of our nutrition labels on products, right?
Yeah, they're all the same, right? It's almost like an API for your telemetry events, as our friend Hazel Weekly likes to say.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, the cool thing is, like, here we have in this picture all these different products. They're different things, but they have the same look and feel for the label. The next thing we have is the OpenTelemetry API, or Application Programming Interface. And the thing with the OTel API is it's the entry point into your telemetry, into your instrumentation. And the other thing, too, is that it defines the methods for instrumenting your application, your infrastructure, etc. Now, with the API, each language has its own API, each language supported by OpenTelemetry.
Yeah, so really just an easy way to think of the API, whether you're making a service or building a library that other people are going to use, the API is the buttons that you push to make your telemetry.
And then that brings us to the SDK. So if the API is the what, the SDK is the how. So the SDK, or Software Development Kit, implements the OpenTelemetry API. And the cool thing about the SDK is, as long as it implements the OpenTelemetry API, you can swap it out. You can start maybe with the standard OpenTelemetry upstream SDK. And then you might think, well, you know what, like this vendor actually has an SDK that I like better. So you can swap it out. Or you can even get adventurous and say, I want to write my own SDK. And you can do that as long as it implements the API. So then it won't break your code. And if you're not ready to commit, you're afraid of commitment, no problem, because the API has a base SDK implementation. So that basically means if you're not ready to choose an SDK, all you have to do is, no problem, use that base implementation and it's not going to break your code. So you can code as you wish and it'll be all good. The only thing is with that base implementation, it means that any instrumentation that you, it's basically not going to send any instrumentation to your observability backend. So just keep that in mind.
The nice thing about the SDK, if you're just using the standard one, right, you plug it in, it has the OTLP exporter plugged in out of the box, you add a little bit of configuration, and you don't have to think that much about how it works. It's just going to do its job, and you can push buttons on the API and get telemetry.
Magic. And that's a perfect segue into our next component, which is OTLP, or the OpenTelemetry protocol. This is the unsung hero of OpenTelemetry, the superhero, the secret sauce, because if you look at we have their semantic conventions, our standardized labels. We have the API, which is the what, the SDK is the how, the OTLP is the format in which all of this gets transported over, right? And the interesting thing about OTLP is that when OpenTelemetry first started, there weren't really any observability backends that could ingest OTLP data natively. So oftentimes the backends would have to create exporters that converted from the OTLP format into the backend specific format. But as OpenTelemetry has continued to gain in popularity, now many observability backends are actually allowing for the ingest of OTLP natively, which just goes to show how much the various vendors and backends really believe in OpenTelemetry.
Yeah, and even some open source ones, right? Like Prometheus and Jaeger, it's really popular. I think OTLP is the unsung hero here. I don't think it gets enough credit most of the time.
Absolutely. And then finally, this is, I'd say, our second favorite component of OpenTelemetry, the OTel collector, also known as the Swiss Army knife of OpenTelemetry, and that is my Swiss Army knife on there. So the OTel collector is wonderful, right? Because it does so much. It's this vendor neutral binary that serves as a data pipeline. It ingests data, it transforms data, so it can do data masking, it can do data filtering, batching, etc. And then it exports the data to a destination. Now, what makes the collector special? Well, first of all, it decouples the source of the telemetry from the destination. It allows you to ingest data from multiple sources, so whether it's application telemetry or infrastructure telemetry. And finally, it has that lovely multicast ability. And as a result, it gives you interoperability.
Right. So this is really awesome. I love this so much. So interoperability, right? It's vendor neutrality in OpenTelemetry is often sold as a way to just switch vendors. And it is true that it will help you with that, right? Like when that day comes where you want to break up with your vendor, there are parts of the OpenTelemetry vendor neutrality that mean that you're not going to have to re-instrument all of your code, as Adriana mentioned earlier. That's a huge win. But to me, the beauty of like OTLP compatibility and all of these tools is not that we can switch tools, but that we can use them together all the time today, right? I think this is awesome.
And it means you can have your cake and eat it too. Yum, yum.
If you're willing to pay for storing two cakes, if we're talking about.
Very true, very true.
So a really common use case for the OpenTelemetry collector and its ability to send data wherever you want would be something like this, right? Where you have an open source tracing backend, a logging backend, and a metrics backend, and you want to use tools that are purpose-built for each one of those use cases. You can certainly do that.
Or say you have an observability backend that ingests all the signals that you know and love. You can send them to that one single backend. Or perhaps you are not willing to commit to a backend yet and you want to compare one vendor against another. No problem, because with OpenTelemetry Collector's multicast capabilities, you can basically send the same telemetry data to two different backends or more at the same time and basically do a bake-off to see which one you like better.
That's pretty cool. You could also do something like this, right? Where say you have some specific requirements, like you have a legal requirement to keep all of your logs for 7 years, but you're also using a fancy new cloud observability platform. Well, keeping 7 years of logs is going to be pretty expensive. So maybe you want to throw it somewhere like a local on-premise storage or S3. and pay a lot less money to deal with that legal compliance while still getting all of the benefits of that awesome observability platform for all of your recent signals, right? Including your most recent logs. Another time you might want to do something like this is say your vendor backend doesn't support a brand new feature that you really want, like OpenTelemetry profiling is brand new and really exciting. There are some open source tools that support profiling, so you can go ahead and plug those in and augment your vendor's capabilities with the capabilities of open source tools. I think that's pretty awesome.
And then finally, well, you might have a case where your organization has said, this is the enterprise standard for all of observability in this company. And so, your SRE team will use this observability backend, which is awesome. But then they're like, well, we don't want to pay for a license for the dev team to use. So that's fine because, our developer who wants to use the telemetry that their code generates to debug their own code, which you should absolutely always do. They can just cobble together some open source tools to run on their desktop and use that to observe their own code.
Yeah. Or something I see really often, right, is one company acquires another company. And you're in the process of migrating off of those tools, but in the meantime, you need to use both of them together. And maybe you also have some sort of centrally mandated requirement to send all of one type of telemetry to like an SRE team or an audit team or something. So you can do all of that.
And so we've explored what OpenTelemetry vendor neutrality means. What about the not so vendor neutral bits of OpenTelemetry? And I'm going to clarify this a little bit because I'm not saying that OpenTelemetry isn't vendor neutral. It's just vendor neutral up until data ingest. Because I think the thing that people get stumped on when we talk about OpenTelemetry vendor neutrality is this idea that, yes, that's correct. I don't have to re-instrument my code. I can just point it to a different observability backend. But just because you're pointing your instrumentation to a different backend doesn't mean that it ends there, because different observability backends do different things. So let's explore what it means actually when you switch an observability backend. So the not so neutral bits, you switch backends, well, guess what? The user interface, the look and feel changes from backend to backend, because if they were the same, they probably wouldn't exist, right? The other thing to keep in mind is when it comes to storage and historical data. Now, many organizations have a mandate to keep historical data for a certain amount of time for compliance reasons. But unfortunately, when you're switching vendors, oftentimes your vendor will not have the ability to export your historical data into the new vendor. So you've got two choices. You either cut the cord, or you're going to have to keep that old vendor for the legacy data until your compliance period ends. So in that case, when you're switching vendors, as Josh mentioned in one of the use cases, you might want to maybe send your telemetry data at the same time to a data store running on your private cloud at the same time that you're sending your telemetry data to your observability backend, which can be a SaaS vendor or whatever. We also have queries and dashboards to keep in mind, right? Because each observability backend will have their own dashboards. They are going to have their own query language, right? So not everyone uses PromQL, so it's often going to be a proprietary query language that you have to learn. So you have to keep that in mind. When it comes to alerts and SLOs, sorry, you're going to have to recreate your alerts and SLOs. That is, if your backend supports alerts and SLOs, in which case you might have to go with a third-party tool and recreate your alerts and SLOs there as well. And then finally, your infrastructure as code. Now, when it comes to infrastructure as code, so there's many observability backends have Terraform providers that allow you to automate various aspects for configuring, setting up your backend. And that includes things like creating those dashboards and writing the queries. But each Terraform provider for backend is going to offer different things. So it's not a matter of like, oh, I'm going from vendor A to vendor B, for example. I can reuse the same Terraform code. You cannot. You have to rewrite it, unfortunately.
Yeah, if anyone has even moved between like different versions of the AWS Terraform provider, I think you can maybe relate to some of this pain, right? It's going to be way worse if you're going from one observability tool to another. Okay, so let's look forward, right? OpenTelemetry has its vendor neutral parts. It has its not so vendor neutral parts. But the open source ecosystem has a lot of stuff going on too that makes this really, really exciting to me. So stepping back, we just kind of think about, right, like all the way on the left, we have like our service that we're maintaining. Everything in purple is code that me or our team wrote. Everything in blue is an OpenTelemetry component that you deploy in your code or on your node, and can, you maybe add some configuration to it for your specific use case. But those are the things that OpenTelemetry gives you. And then OpenTelemetry very explicitly does not concern itself with anything in this yellow box over here on the right. But there are open source tools that do fill that gap. So what we need, right, really we need some kind of data store. We need somewhere to put all of the data that we can expose. We need some kind of query language so that we can interact with that data. If that query language is standardized, then we can have standardized dashboards and visualizations, which is the sort of the last step of actually making this useful, because telemetry just on a disk is expensive and not useful, right? So some of my favorite tools here, right? We have Prometheus, which is the de facto standard for metrics. It's a great tool. It uses PromQL as the query language. And then we have a number of other PromQL compatible tools that are all awesome. Cortex and Thanos from the CNCF, Victoria Metrics from Victoria Metrics, and Mimir from Grafana. These are great tools, right? Then we have sort of the Lucene ecosystem of tools that are great for logging. If you are not familiar with Lucene, you may have actually written a Lucene query without realizing it, because it's used in a lot of vendors' log search tools. And then OpenSearch and Elasticsearch are two great open source backends for that. Apache Solr is also an option here. In the world of SQL compatible tools, right, of course we have Postgres, which is probably the most popular and flexible database on the planet right now. It's awesome. It is not very well architected for observability data, but I'm a huge fan of just using what you already have until it breaks. So if you already have Postgres, that can work. TimescaleDB is an extension of Postgres that teaches it how to be more observability focused, specifically when we're talking about time series and metrics. I'm a huge fan of ClickHouse as an open source observability backend. If you look me up, you can see me talking a lot more about that. And InfluxDB is really popular and common. I use this in my home lab, so that's how it made it the list. It does not support SQL. It has its own query language, Flux, but it's a pretty awesome tool. And then for visualization, right, we have Grafana, which is sort of the de facto most mature standard that can speak to all of these databases on this list and visualize the data, right? Persis is brand new from the CNCF. It's very, very exciting right now. It supports PromQL, and soon it will support other data sources and backends. And it is completely vendor neutral to the point that some vendors even embed it in their product, which then would give us the ability, like if more vendors did that, then we could just sort of export our Persis dashboards, right? And we'd have vendor neutral dashboards. That would be awesome. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Kibana as part of the Elk stack. And then Apache Superset is one that I really like. It's not really purpose-built for observability, but if you're trying to explore your observability data along with lots of other data, it can be a really great tool for that.
Well, and this takes us to how is it that OpenTelemetry can live up to its promise of vendor neutrality, and how is it doing it now, right? And really, like, OTel is a hugely successful project of the CNCF. I mean, it is the second largest project of the CNCF, and considering that it's been around since 2019, that is a huge deal.
Yep.
But why is it successful? Well, first of all, it is open. As Josh said, observability begs to be open. It's nice to have an open standard, because by having an open standard, we invite collaboration. So you don't have one organization hoarding that standard and having to create that standard. You've got multiple organizations, multiple people working towards this common good. And so now you've got like all sorts of innovation happening as a result.
Yeah. And openness alone is not enough, right? Like OpenTelemetry has bucked that XKCD comic that we're all familiar with of multiplying standards. So there's more to it, right? It's the cooperation. My first contributions to OpenTelemetry were fostered by people who worked at multiple competitors of the company I was working with at the time. But we're all friends now. And that's one of my favorite things about the OpenTelemetry community.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I remember one of the first times I interacted with Josh, he attended a webinar that the OTel and user SIG was running on writing a good talk proposal. And he did a great write-up on his personal blog. And I said, hey, can you contribute that to the OpenTelemetry blog? And yeah, that's how we became acquainted. And then finally, we have stewardship. OpenTelemetry is a CNCF project, and it is not hoarded by any one particular organization. There isn't one organization that is the star. There are multiple observability vendors that are fully behind OpenTelemetry. And because of that, I mean, I talked earlier about ingesting vendors ingesting OTLP natively. That is because all of these organizations believe in OpenTelemetry, and it has made OpenTelemetry the de facto standard for observability.
Yeah. Thank you to the CNCF for providing the framework for that.
Absolutely.
So, okay, that's all nice, but like, what do you get out of it, right? How does this actually tangibly benefit you and make your day-to-day life easier? Well, as we mentioned, right, there is the portability, there is the possibility to change vendors or change tools if you want to or if you need to. And then, of course, as I've kind of highlighted, is like my favorite part is that interoperability, that ability to use multiple tools together all the time today.
And as a result, you get choice. Amazing. As we've mentioned multiple times, you can send your data to one observability backend, multiple. You can mix and match, and that's amazing. That's something that you did not have in the before times, before OpenTelemetry existed. You hated your vendor, you were stuck with them. And so, as a result, it lives up to the promise of observability, which is about asking meaningful questions,
getting useful answers,
and taking action. And so we will leave you now with some references and shameless self-promotions. So we've got a link to Josh's original LinkedIn post that you can check out. I've included a link to my Medium article in which I dug into Josh's LinkedIn post. And as I mentioned, I have a podcast called Geeking Out. The logo, as you notice, is a capybara. My daughter has designed that logo. She's helped me with some editing. And I've had some really cool guests in the cloud native community, outside the cloud native community, including Liz Fong-Jones, Abby Bangser, Kat Cosgrove. I think my most famous guests to date have been Kelsey Hightower, and I recently interviewed Scott Hanselman, and Josh is going to be on my podcast soon.
Not as famous as those people. Looking forward to it. And I was jealous, so I also started a podcast. It's called Unevenly Distributed, and I've just got 3 episodes where I've been interviewing folks in the data lake space.
And with that, danke.
Danke.
Amazing. So I think we have still time for 2 or 3 more questions. Yes, or is there a raised hand over there? Raise your hands, get yourself some gummy bears.
Not much of a question, more like an addition. There's a tracing module for Postgres. So if you want OTel stuff from Postgres, have a look at it. And from the destination stacks that you've shown, you might also want to look at OpenObserve.
Okay.
Which combines pretty much everything.
Okay. We'll definitely have to take a look at
Cool.
that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, yes. Yes, no. 3, 2, 1, done. And thanks again. Give us a hand for Adriana and Josh, and we'll see you back in 5 minutes for the next talk.